Welcome to History for Sleep, where the stories of our world unfold as you drift into dreams. Tonight, let the ancient past guide your imagination, from forgotten kingdoms to mysteries buried beneath the sands of time. Before your eyelids grow heavy, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, so the next time you can fall asleep to another story from the ages. Now, close your eyes, let history become your lullaby. And as you drift away, let's get into the video. The Serpent and Enki. Could there be a connection between Eden and Sumer? The story of the serpent in the Garden of Eden has intrigued scholars, theologians, and historians for centuries. In Genesis 3, the serpent tempts Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge, leading to what many interpret as humanity's first transgression. But what if this narrative has deeper roots in earlier Mesopotamian myths? Could there be a connection between the figure of the serpent and Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom, water, and creation? Who was Enki, and how did he interact with humans? Enki, known as Ea in Akkadian traditions, is often described as a god of intelligence, water, and creation. But how should we understand his role? Was he primarily a benefactor of humanity, a trickster figure, or perhaps both? In texts like the Eridu Genesis and the Atrahasis epic, Enki seems to intervene on behalf of humans, offering knowledge and guidance, sometimes even in defiance of other gods. Could this aspect of Enki, a god who provides humans with restricted knowledge, be reflected in the Genesis story? The serpent offers knowledge to Eve, and Enki grants human skills and understanding in Mesopotamian myths. Is it possible that both serve a similar narrative function as mediators of wisdom? Or are these similarities coincidental, arising from a broader human fascination with knowledge and morality? What does the tree of knowledge represent? In Genesis, the tree of knowledge of good and evil represents something forbidden, something powerful and dangerous. Humans are explicitly told not to partake of it. Could this idea have parallels in Sumerian myths, where certain knowledge, such as secrets of life, creation, or immortality, is restricted by divine authority? In the story of Adapa, for example, a human priest of Enki is given access to some divine knowledge but is denied immortality. Does this suggest that Mesopotamian culture also grappled with the tension between empowerment and restriction? Could the tree of knowledge be a literary way of expressing that tension, that gaining wisdom always comes with consequences? Is there a link between Enki and serpent symbolism? Interestingly, serpents in Mesopotamian iconography are often associated with water, wisdom, and regenerative power. Enki, as a god connected to freshwater and knowledge, shares some of these symbolic traits. Could this explain why the serpent in Genesis is depicted as a creature of cunning, able to convey forbidden wisdom? What if the serpent is not simply a literal creature, but a symbol for intelligence or divine mediation? Enki's role in Sumerian myths is often similar. He intervenes on humanity's behalf, granting them knowledge that other gods might restrict. Does this parallel suggest a shared cultural memory, or are we reading too much into visual and thematic similarities? How does Enki distribute forbidden knowledge? In myths like Enki and Ninmah, Enki works with the mother goddess Ninmah to create humans, granting them faculties for survival and intelligence. In the Atrahasis epic, he instructs Atrahasis to survive a flood decreed by Enlil. In both cases, knowledge that might be considered restricted or forbidden is mediated by Enki. Could the serpent in Genesis play a similar role? Is it possible that both figures, Enki and the serpent, represent the idea that wisdom is not simply given, but carefully mediated? And if so, what does that suggest about humanity's understanding of divine authority and moral responsibility in these early texts? What parallels exist between Eden and Sumerian sacred spaces? When we compare Eden to Sumerian myths, some patterns emerge. The garden or sacred space, Eden, is a lush, ordered space where humans encounter the divine. In Sumerian texts, temples and sacred gardens in cities like Eridu may have served as spaces where humans and gods interacted. Could these spaces have inspired similar narrative motifs? Forbidden knowledge. Both traditions seem to grapple with restricted knowledge. Is the tree of knowledge an echo of Sumerian ideas about limits on human understanding and the moral responsibilities that come with wisdom? Mediator figures, the serpent and Enki both act as intermediaries of knowledge. But is the serpent intended to be dangerous, helpful, or morally ambiguous? Does Enki's ambiguous role in Sumerian myth help us reinterpret the serpent's function in Genesis? Consequences of transgression. In both traditions, obtaining forbidden knowledge has consequences: expulsion from Eden in Genesis, or divine decrees and punishments in Sumerian texts. What might these parallels tell us about early human views of morality, obedience, and responsibility? Could the serpent represent more than a creature? The serpent is portrayed as clever and persuasive. In Genesis, it tempts Eve to question divine authority and to exercise moral choice. Could this reflect a broader archetype present in Mesopotamian culture, one that embodies intelligence, cunning, and divine mediation? In Sumerian art, serpentine imagery often accompanies water deities, linking the serpent to life, wisdom, and transformation. Does this connection hint that the serpent in Genesis is a symbolic continuation of these ancient motifs? Or are we projecting modern interpretations onto texts that had different cultural meanings? What does this say about human moral development? Enki's interventions in Sumerian myth seem designed to guide and test humanity. By providing knowledge, he fosters responsibility and growth. Similarly, the serpent in Eden initiates a moral awakening. Humans gain the capacity to discern good and evil, to make choices, and to face consequences. Could it be that both narratives are trying to convey the same principle, that knowledge and wisdom are not neutral gifts, but challenges requiring moral discernment? And if so, what does that imply about how early cultures conceptualized the relationship between humans and the divine? Discussion points for further exploration. How strong are the parallels between Enki and the serpent? Are they coincidental, symbolic, or evidence of cultural transmission? Does the tree of knowledge in Genesis correspond to specific Sumerian myths about forbidden wisdom? How does the mediator role of the serpent compare with Enki's interventions? Are humans portrayed as morally responsible agents in both traditions, and what does this tell us about early views of ethics and knowledge? Could serpents in Genesis symbolize wisdom, divine guidance, or moral testing rather than being literal creatures? It is difficult to assert definitively that Enki and the serpent in Genesis are the same figure, or that one directly inspired the other. Yet the parallels, a mediator of knowledge, access to forbidden wisdom, moral consequences for humans, and the symbolic role of serpents, invite reflection. Could the Eden narrative be part of a broader Near Eastern tradition that explores the complexities of divine knowledge and human responsibility? In Part 2, we can continue this discussion by examining Enki's interventions more closely and asking how these stories might have shaped the Genesis narrative, particularly regarding humanity's moral development and the concept of forbidden knowledge. Enki's interventions and the Genesis narrative, forbidden knowledge and human responsibility. In the first part, we explored possible parallels between the serpent in Genesis and the Sumerian god Enki. Could it be that both function as mediators of knowledge, guiding humanity into moral and intellectual awareness? In Part 2, we turn our attention to specific stories of Enki's interventions in Sumerian texts and ask, how might these have influenced or shaped the narrative of forbidden knowledge in Genesis? Enki as intermediary, what does this mean for humanity? Enki often acts as a mediator between humans and higher divine authority. In the Atrahasis epic, he warns humanity of impending catastrophe, instructing Atrahasis to build an ark to survive a flood. In other stories, he grants humans the arts of civilization, agriculture, craftsmanship, and irrigation. Could these actions be seen as a form of forbidden knowledge? While the gods retained ultimate authority, Enki selectively provided humans with understanding that enabled them to shape their own destiny. Does this resemble the serpent's role in Eden, presenting humans with knowledge that was restricted but transformative? If so, does the Genesis narrative cast the serpent as a morally ambiguous figure, similar to Enki, whose intentions are not necessarily evil but whose actions challenge divine boundaries? The duality of knowledge and morality. A recurring theme in both Sumerian and Genesis narratives is the tension between knowledge and morality. Humans are granted insight or understanding, but with knowledge comes responsibility. How does this tension manifest in Enki's interventions? For instance, in Enki and Ninmah, humans are created with skills and faculties that allow them to survive and thrive. Yet, these gifts also bring consequences. They must navigate life's challenges, understand limitations, and face the realities of mortality. Could the Eden story serve a similar function? When Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, they gain moral discernment but also confront sin, mortality, and exile. Are both traditions exploring the idea that wisdom cannot exist without ethical accountability? Restricted knowledge and divine limits. In many Sumerian myths, certain knowledge is explicitly restricted. For example, immortality or the deeper secrets of creation are not freely given to humans. Enki sometimes bends these restrictions to aid humanity, as in the flood story, where he preserves life despite Enlil's decree. Could the serpent be performing a similar function? By encouraging Eve to eat the fruit, is the serpent merely facilitating access to knowledge that was otherwise inaccessible? Does this imply a nuanced understanding of divine-human relations in Genesis, where disobedience and moral awakening are intertwined? Parallels in consequences. Another interesting point is the role of consequences. In Sumerian myth, humans often face repercussions when divine laws are challenged. The flood in Atrahasis is a direct response to human overpopulation and noise, which displeased Enlil. Even though Enki intervenes to preserve life, humans must endure hardship and limitations. In Genesis, the consequence of eating the forbidden fruit is exile from Eden, toil, and mortality. Could this parallel suggest a shared cultural concern that knowledge, while empowering, carries unavoidable consequences? Are these narratives cautionary tales, emphasizing the moral weight of human choice? The role of the serpent as a moral test. The serpent in Genesis is often interpreted as a tempter, but could it also function as a moral instructor, testing human awareness and judgment? Similarly, Enki provides humans with knowledge but expects them to use it responsibly. Does this suggest that both narratives explore the idea of moral testing, that humans are not simply passive recipients of divine guidance but active participants in their own ethical development? If so, how might this shape our understanding of the Eden story beyond the simplistic notion of disobedience? Creation, knowledge, and human agency. In Sumerian myths, humans are shaped by divine hands but endowed with faculties that require decision-making and skill. Enki's gifts are not meant to enslave, they are meant to empower. Could the tree of knowledge in Genesis serve a similar symbolic function, granting humanity agency and responsibility while presenting limits? If both narratives emphasize human agency, does this indicate a broader ancient perspective, that wisdom and choice are inseparable from ethical responsibility? Could it be that the Genesis story is not just about punishment but about the inherent challenges of moral awareness? Interpreting the serpent through Mesopotamian symbolism. Serpents in Mesopotamian iconography are often linked to water, regeneration, and life-giving forces. Enki, as a god of freshwater, shares these associations. Could the serpent in Genesis reflect these symbolic traits, rather than being purely malevolent? If so, does this perspective invite a re-evaluation of the Eden story? Perhaps the serpent represents not evil, but the complex nature of knowledge, the potential for both enlightenment and consequence. Could this align with Enki's portrayal as a god whose guidance is morally ambiguous but ultimately intended to foster growth? Questions to consider. Could Enki's role as mediator of forbidden knowledge explain the function of the serpent in Genesis? How do both traditions treat the relationship between wisdom and morality? Are the consequences of transgressing divine limits meant as punishment, instruction, or both? Could the serpent symbolize knowledge itself, rather than a being with independent moral intent? What does the human response to Enki or the serpent reveal about ancient views of agency, responsibility, and ethical choice? While it is difficult to claim a direct connection between Enki and the serpent, the parallels invite thoughtful questions. Both challenge the boundaries of divine authority, both provide humans with transformative knowledge, and both highlight the responsibilities that accompany wisdom. Could these stories reflect a shared cultural concern with moral development, human agency, and the consequences of knowledge? In Part 3, we will continue this discussion by examining the figure of the serpent and Enki in relation to the garden itself, exploring themes of sacred space, temptation, and human interaction with the divine. Sacred space and the garden, human interaction with the divine. In Part 2, we explored how Enki's interventions in Sumerian myth might parallel the serpent's role in Genesis. Could both figures reflect a shared concern with the distribution of knowledge and human responsibility? In Part 3, the focus shifts to the setting of these narratives, the sacred space of the garden in Genesis and the analogous spaces in Sumerian mythology. Could examining the garden help us better understand the interactions between humans and the divine? What is the Garden of Eden, and why is it significant? Genesis describes Eden as a lush, ordered space, a place where humans coexist in harmony with the divine and with nature. It is a garden, but is it only a physical location, or might it also be symbolic of a state of moral and spiritual awareness? Could the garden represent a space of divine-human interaction, similar to the sacred precincts of Sumerian cities like Eridu or Ur? In these ancient cities, temples and ziggurats were considered the dwelling places of gods. Humans entered these spaces to seek guidance, participate in rituals, or gain knowledge. Might the garden in Genesis reflect a similar conceptual framework, a place where access to divine insight is possible, but boundaries must be respected? Are there parallels between Eden and Sumerian temple complexes? Sumerian sacred spaces were carefully structured. They included gardens, courtyards, and water features, and they were centers of both religious and practical life. Priests acted as intermediaries, conveying the will of the gods and teaching human skills or knowledge. Could Eden be imagined in a similar way? Was the tree of knowledge a focal point of sacred instruction, akin to how temples functioned as sites of learning and mediation in Sumer? And if so, why does Genesis focus on the human encounter with a single tree and a single serpent, whereas Sumerian myths often depict complex interactions with multiple deities? Could this simplification reflect a theological emphasis on human choice and accountability? Enki and sacred space. Enki's domain in Sumerian mythology is often associated with fresh water, the Apsu, and with places of creation and wisdom. He is linked to Eridu, considered one of the earliest cities in Mesopotamia. Eridu's temple complex was described as a place where humans could access divine knowledge. Could the Garden of Eden be conceptually similar to Eridu, a sacred space where humans are invited into a relationship with the divine? If so, what might this say about the narrative role of the serpent? Could it represent the mechanism by which humans are tested or initiated into understanding, much like the way priests in Sumerian temples mediated access to divine insight? Temptation and moral choice. In Genesis, the serpent tempts Eve, presenting a choice: obey divine prohibition or gain knowledge. Could this scenario reflect a broader theme found in Sumerian myths, that access to knowledge is intertwined with moral decision-making? Enki's gifts are often beneficial, but they are not without consequences. For instance, the flood narrative demonstrates that even the best-intentioned human actions have repercussions within a larger divine framework. Could the serpent in Genesis function in a similar way, as a symbol of the moral and ethical responsibility that accompanies knowledge? Sacred space as a site of transformation. Sacred spaces in both traditions appear to be transformative. In Sumerian myths, entering a temple or sacred precinct is an act of engagement with divine order. Humans gain skills, understanding, and sometimes warnings about their future. In Eden, entering the garden places humans in a state of potentiality. They can follow divine guidance or exercise their own judgment. Does this imply that sacred spaces, whether physical or symbolic, are arenas for testing human agency and moral discernment? If so, could the serpent represent the natural tension between guidance and freedom, between obedience and choice? Water, life, and knowledge. Water is a recurring motif in both traditions. Enki is the god of fresh water, associated with creation and life-sustaining wisdom. The Garden of Eden contains the rivers that water the land, supporting life and growth. Could this parallel suggest that the Eden narrative incorporates symbolic elements from Mesopotamian thought? Is the serpent's association with knowledge also linked symbolically to water, as a source of life, nourishment, and renewal? If so, what might this tell us about the way early authors conceptualized the relationship between divine insight and the natural world? Questions to explore. Is Eden primarily a physical space, a symbolic space, or both? Could Sumerian temples and sacred precincts have influenced the conceptualization of the garden? How does the serpent function within the garden, as a tempter, mediator, or symbol of moral testing? Does access to sacred space imply responsibility, knowledge, or ethical challenge? How might motifs of water and life connect the garden and Enki's domain in a thematic sense? Human interaction with the divine. Both Genesis and Sumerian myths emphasize interaction between humans and divine forces. In Sumerian texts, humans learn skills, gain warnings, or receive moral instruction from gods like Enki. In Genesis, humans encounter the serpent, face a moral decision, and experience the consequences of their choice. Could this suggest that both traditions explore the same underlying concern, how humans navigate the balance between divine guidance and personal responsibility? If sacred space serves as the setting for this engagement, might the garden and Sumerian temples represent an archetype of learning, testing, and moral development? Looking at the Garden of Eden as a sacred space, rather than simply a setting for a narrative, opens new avenues for comparison with Sumerian mythology. Could the story of the serpent reflect the way Enki interacts with humans within sacred precincts, mediating access to knowledge and testing human responsibility? These questions invite further discussion about the moral and ethical dimensions of forbidden knowledge, the symbolic function of the serpent, and the role of sacred spaces in shaping human interaction with the divine. In Part 4, we will explore the nature of knowledge itself, what constitutes forbidden knowledge, how it is mediated by figures like Enki or the serpent, and what the consequences of accessing it reveal about ancient perspectives on human responsibility. Forbidden knowledge, mediation, morality, and human responsibility. In Part 3, we examined the Garden of Eden as a sacred space and considered possible parallels with Sumerian temples, where humans could interact with the divine. But what about the knowledge contained within these spaces? Both the serpent in Genesis and Enki in Sumerian myths are linked to knowledge that is restricted, controlled, or transformative. Could these stories be asking deeper questions about human responsibility, morality, and the limits of understanding? What is forbidden knowledge? In Genesis, the tree of knowledge of good and evil represents a kind of wisdom that humans are forbidden to possess. But what exactly is this knowledge? Is it purely moral, the awareness of right and wrong, or could it also encompass practical, social, or spiritual understanding? Sumerian texts often depict knowledge as powerful but limited in accessibility. Enki provides humans with the arts of civilization, agriculture, writing, irrigation, and medicine. Yet certain secrets, like immortality or the ultimate workings of the cosmos, remain restricted. Could the biblical tree of knowledge reflect a similar concern, that some knowledge carries inherent responsibility and consequences? Enki as mediator of forbidden knowledge. Enki often acts as an intermediary between humans and the divine authority of Enlil or other gods. He selectively shares knowledge that can help humans survive, thrive, or adapt to challenges. But what is the intention behind this mediation? Is Enki empowering humanity, testing them, or simply facilitating a natural unfolding of human potential? Could the serpent function in a comparable way? When it offers Eve access to the fruit, is it merely presenting a moral choice, or is it offering an opportunity for growth and understanding? And if so, does this change how we interpret the serpent, not as a purely deceptive figure, but as a symbol of mediated wisdom? Consequences of accessing forbidden knowledge. A key question arises: why is knowledge restricted at all? In Sumerian myths, defying divine boundaries can have serious repercussions. The flood in the Atrahasis epic is a response to human overpopulation and behavior that displeased the gods. Even when Enki intervenes to mitigate disaster, humans are still subject to divine law. In Genesis, eating the forbidden fruit results in exile from Eden, labor, mortality, and the beginnings of human suffering. Are these consequences meant primarily as punishment, or are they inherent outcomes of gaining understanding? Could both traditions be exploring the idea that wisdom is inseparable from responsibility, that knowledge itself carries unavoidable moral weight? Human responsibility and moral agency. Both traditions seem to emphasize human choice. In Sumerian myths, humans must use the skills and wisdom provided by Enki responsibly. Failure to do so often leads to hardship, conflict, or divine correction. In Genesis, Adam and Eve make a conscious choice to eat the fruit, gaining awareness of good and evil, and must face the consequences of their action. Could this suggest that these narratives are less about right or wrong actions and more about the ethical dimensions of human agency? Are they asking us to consider, how do humans respond when presented with knowledge that challenges divine or societal boundaries? The Serpent and Enki, comparative roles. The Serpent and Enki share several qualities. Intermediaries of knowledge, both provide access to wisdom that is otherwise restricted. Agents of moral testing, humans must respond to the opportunity thoughtfully and responsibly. Ambiguity of intent, neither figure is portrayed as entirely malevolent or entirely benevolent. Catalysts for transformation, interaction with both leads to profound changes in human understanding, morality, and society. Could this similarity indicate a shared cultural theme in ancient narratives? Are these stories reflecting human concerns about the power and limits of knowledge, rather than literal historical events? Knowledge as a double-edged sword. Another question emerges: is knowledge inherently dangerous, or is it the human use of knowledge that determines its consequences? Enki provides tools and insight, but humans must act responsibly. In Genesis, the serpent offers the fruit, but Adam and Eve's choice determines the outcome. Does this suggest that both traditions grapple with a universal human concern, the balance between empowerment and ethical responsibility? Could the stories be exploring the tension between curiosity, wisdom, and moral accountability? Moral and ethical implications. The narratives raise questions about the role of moral instruction in myth. Are humans expected to navigate knowledge carefully, weighing potential benefits and harms? Is transgression a necessary part of learning, or a warning against overreach? Could the stories of Enki and the Serpent be attempts to teach early audiences about the responsibilities that accompany intellectual and moral agency? Perhaps the forbidden nature of the knowledge is not about secrecy itself, but about the human capacity to handle insight responsibly. Questions to consider. What counts as forbidden knowledge, and why might it be restricted in ancient narratives? How do Enki and the Serpent differ in their methods of presenting knowledge to humans? Are the consequences in both traditions a form of punishment, or a natural result of human action? Could these myths be early reflections on ethical reasoning, about how humans should use the tools and wisdom they are given? What does this suggest about the ancient view of human agency and moral responsibility? The stories of the Serpent and Enki seem to invite reflection rather than dictate judgment. Both raise questions about knowledge, morality, and human responsibility. Could it be that these narratives are more concerned with the ethical use of wisdom than with literal historical events? In Part 5, we will explore the creation of humanity and the imparting of wisdom, how Enki shapes humans in Sumerian myths, how the serpent engages with Adam and Eve, and what these interactions reveal about early perspectives on knowledge, agency, and divine human relationships. When compared with Enki, the serpent seems to perform a similar function, presenting humans with the opportunity to gain wisdom, but leaving the ultimate decision in their hands. Could this parallel suggest that both myths are concerned with the ethical dimensions of knowledge and the development of human judgment? Knowledge as an inherently transformative force. Both narratives imply that knowledge, once obtained, transforms humanity. In Sumerian myth, the skills granted by Enki allow humans to build cities, cultivate crops, and organize society. Yet this empowerment comes with obligations. Humans must use these skills responsibly or face consequences. In Genesis, the knowledge from the tree of good and evil transforms Adam and Eve's perception of themselves, their environment, and their relationship with God. Could this suggest a broader theme, that wisdom is inherently transformative, capable of reshaping human identity and societal structures? If so, what might this tell us about the purpose of these myths? Are they early attempts to reflect on human growth, ethics, and the development of civilization itself? The interplay of divine guidance and human choice. In both traditions, there is a delicate balance between divine guidance and human agency. Enki provides instruction and tools but allows humans to act independently. Similarly, the serpent in Eden provides access to knowledge, but Adam and Eve ultimately choose how to respond. Could this interplay highlight a central concern of ancient narratives, that wisdom and power come with responsibility, and that humans must actively engage with these gifts rather than passively receiving them? Furthermore, could these stories be asking us to consider how knowledge and morality are intertwined, that understanding requires ethical reflection, not simply acquisition of facts or skills? The role of consequences in human development. Both Sumerian and Genesis narratives emphasize that actions have consequences. In Sumerian myths, defiance of divine boundaries can lead to natural disasters, social disruption, or divine reprimand. In Genesis, the consequence of eating the fruit is exile from Eden, mortality, and the challenges of labor and survival. Could the consequences serve as a narrative tool to teach the weight of human decisions? Are they less about punishment and more about illustrating the responsibilities that come with knowledge and agency? Might this imply that early human authors were reflecting on ethical education, using stories to explore how humans should navigate the complex relationship between ability, wisdom, and morality? Comparing Enki and the Serpent. Several points of comparison emerge when considering Enki and the Serpent. Mediator of knowledge, both facilitate access to wisdom that humans would not otherwise obtain. Catalyst for transformation, interaction with either figure leads to profound changes in human capacity and awareness. Ambiguity of intent, neither figure is portrayed as entirely benevolent or malevolent, their actions challenge humans to act responsibly. Ethical testing, humans must exercise judgment in response to the knowledge provided. Could these parallels suggest that the two figures represent archetypal roles in ancient narratives, the giver of wisdom and the facilitator of moral growth? Are these stories less about historical events and more about exploring the ethical and developmental dimensions of humanity? Questions to explore. How does Enki's creation of humans compare with the moral awakening of Adam and Eve? Is knowledge in both traditions inherently transformative, and what does that imply about human potential? How do the consequences in each story shape human understanding and societal development? Could the serpent be interpreted as a symbolic figure representing opportunity, moral challenge, or guidance? What might these myths reveal about ancient conceptions of agency, responsibility, and the human-divine relationship? Both the Sumerian myths of Enki and the Genesis story of the serpent raise questions about creation, wisdom, and human agency. They suggest that knowledge is not merely a gift or a tool, but a transformative force that requires ethical consideration and responsible action. Could it be that these stories reflect ancient human concerns about morality, choice, and the responsibilities that come with understanding? In Part 6, we will explore how these narratives deal with consequences in more depth, how divine restrictions, moral tests, and human decisions intersect, and what these intersections reveal about ancient perspectives on law, morality, and human development. Divine restrictions and human choice, consequences of knowledge. In Part 5, we explored creation, wisdom, and human agency, comparing Enki's role in Sumerian myths with the serpent in Genesis. Both figures provide humans with access to knowledge, raising questions about responsibility, moral development, and transformation. In Part 6, we turn to the consequences of knowledge, how divine restrictions, human choice, and moral responsibility interact in these narratives. Could these stories be reflecting ancient ideas about ethics, law, and the costs of awareness? Why are some knowledges forbidden? Both Genesis and Sumerian texts suggest that certain knowledge is restricted. In Genesis, humans are explicitly forbidden to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In Sumerian myths, secrets of the gods, immortality, or cosmic order are often inaccessible to humans. But why might knowledge be forbidden? Is it because humans are not yet capable of handling it responsibly, or is the restriction a way to assert divine authority? Could the limitation itself be a moral or pedagogical device, emphasizing the importance of discernment and self-restraint? Does this suggest that ancient authors were grappling with questions of ethical development? How should humans act when presented with powerful tools or insight? Enki's interventions and consequences. Enki often provides humans with knowledge despite divine restrictions, as seen in the Atrahasis epic or Enki and Ninmah. Yet even when he intervenes, consequences remain. Humans must cope with mortality, disasters, and limits on their freedom. Could this imply that access to wisdom is never without cost? Might the Sumerian texts be suggesting that even benevolent guidance carries responsibilities and risks? If we consider the serpent in Genesis in this light, does it similarly offer knowledge while leaving humans accountable for their decisions? Are the consequences in Eden, exile, toil, and mortality, analogous to the Sumerian emphasis on the balance between empowerment and limitation? Human choice as central theme. Both traditions emphasize that the human response to knowledge determines outcomes. In Sumerian myths, humans must act responsibly when given skills and guidance. failure can result in suffering, divine correction, or societal consequences. In Genesis, Adam and Eve's choice to eat the fruit triggers a cascade of changes in their lives and in human history. Could this suggest that these narratives are less about the evil of disobedience and more about the ethical use of understanding? Are they exploring human responsibility in the face of freedom and moral complexity? Moral testing and education. The interaction between divine restriction and human choice could be viewed as a form of moral education. In Sumerian texts, Enki's mediation allows humans to navigate the consequences of their actions, providing opportunities for growth and learning. Similarly, the serpent presents a choice that tests human judgment, forcing reflection on obedience, curiosity, and ethical discernment. Is it possible that these myths are early frameworks for teaching moral reasoning, illustrating that wisdom carries responsibilities and that decisions have lasting consequences? Consequences as transformation. Another question arises: are the consequences themselves part of the knowledge? In Genesis, exile from Eden transforms Adam and Eve's understanding of the world and their relationship with God. In Sumerian myths, surviving disasters or adapting to limitations imposed by the gods shapes human experience and societal development. Could this imply that consequences are not purely punitive but also formative? Are they integral to human maturation, moral awareness, and the development of civilization? The ambiguity of the serpent and Enki. Both the serpent and Enki occupy morally ambiguous roles. Enki provides knowledge but cannot shield humans from the results of their actions. The serpent provides an opportunity for awareness, but the ultimate outcome depends on human choice. Does this ambiguity suggest a nuanced perspective on morality in ancient narratives, that knowledge and guidance are not inherently good or evil, but their value is determined by human action? Could these stories be emphasizing that ethical responsibility accompanies every gift of wisdom? Questions to consider. Why might ancient myths present some knowledge as restricted? How do consequences in Sumerian myths and Genesis shape human moral development? Are divine restrictions a form of ethical guidance, rather than arbitrary control? Does the ambiguity of Enki and the serpent reflect a belief that morality is relational, depending on human choice and action? Could these narratives be early explorations of the tension between freedom, responsibility, and the transformative power of knowledge? By examining consequences, divine restrictions, and human choice, both the Genesis and Sumerian narratives appear to emphasize the ethical dimensions of wisdom. Knowledge is empowering, yet it carries responsibility. Choices matter, and consequences shape human development, morality, and society. Could it be that these stories were intended not simply to explain origins or cosmology, but to engage readers in reflection on ethical reasoning, human agency, and the costs of understanding? In Part 7, we will explore the symbolic roles of the serpent and Enki further, examining how their interactions with humans convey lessons about wisdom, morality, and the limits of divine-human interaction. Symbolism, mediation, and moral lessons, the serpent and Enki. In the previous section, we considered the relationship between divine restrictions and human choice, how both the Sumerian and Genesis narratives emphasize consequences as formative experiences. Now, in Part 7, we move deeper into the symbolic dimension of the serpent and Enki. What do these figures represent within their respective stories? Are they simply characters within a myth, or do they serve as larger symbols for wisdom, mediation, and the complexity of divine-human interaction? Why symbols matter in ancient texts? Before examining the serpent and Enki specifically, it helps to ask a broader question: why did ancient cultures use symbols at all? Is it possible that symbolism allowed early storytellers to express truths that could not easily be stated directly, truths about morality, power, and the unseen world? Could mythic imagery serve as a kind of language for discussing spiritual and ethical realities beyond literal description? If so, then perhaps the serpent and Enki were not simply divine beings or animals, but vehicles for expressing profound questions about knowledge, wisdom, and the relationship between humanity and the divine. The serpent as a symbol. The serpent is one of the oldest and most widespread symbols in human history. It appears in the art and mythology of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Canaan, Greece, and beyond. Sometimes it represents life and renewal because of the snake's ability to shed its skin. In other contexts, it symbolizes cunning, wisdom, or danger. In the Eden story, the serpent speaks, an act that blurs the boundary between human and divine communication. But why a serpent? Could the serpent's ambiguous nature, at once earthly and mystical, have made it the perfect figure for conveying both temptation and transformation? Might the serpent embody the dual nature of knowledge itself? It enlightens, but it also exposes; it elevates, but it can lead to loss of innocence. And how might the ancient Israelites have understood the serpent's role, as an enemy of God, or as a test of moral discernment? Could the serpent have symbolized humanity's confrontation with wisdom itself, the moment when curiosity meets commandment? Enki as a symbol of mediation. Turning to Enki, we find another complex symbol, a deity associated not only with water and creation, but with intelligence, craftsmanship, and balance. Enki is often portrayed as a mediator between the high gods and humanity, negotiating mercy or offering solutions in times of crisis. In this sense, Enki occupies a role similar to the serpent's; both act as go-betweens, bridging the gap between divine and human realms. But unlike the serpent, Enki is rarely punished. Why might that be? Could it be that in the Sumerian worldview, knowledge was seen as part of divine order, something to be used wisely rather than feared? Might Enki's actions have been viewed as extensions of his divine responsibility rather than defiance? If the serpent represents the human desire to know, could Enki represent the divine willingness to teach, carefully, selectively, and within limits? Mediation and moral lessons. In both stories, mediation leads to moral testing. When Enki provides knowledge to humans, they must learn to use it responsibly. When the serpent offers wisdom to Eve, she must decide how to respond to the tension between divine command and human curiosity. Could this parallel suggest that both myths explore the same fundamental question: how should humanity respond to knowledge? Is knowledge meant to be freely taken, or must it be granted? And when it is received, how should it be used? These are ethical questions as much as spiritual ones. Perhaps the serpent and Enki are not adversaries of the divine order but instruments through which humans confront the moral dimension of wisdom. The double-edged nature of wisdom. Throughout ancient literature, wisdom is portrayed as a double-edged gift. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, wisdom leads to both enlightenment and sorrow, for knowing one's limits can be painful. In Genesis, the fruit of knowledge grants understanding, but it also brings awareness of sin and mortality. Could both stories be wrestling with the same paradox, that to know more is to suffer more, but also to grow more? If so, does the serpent's gift and Enki's guidance serve as metaphors for humanity's coming of age, the painful but necessary transition from innocence to moral responsibility? And might that transition be the very thing that defines what it means to be human? Enki and the ethic of balance. In Sumerian thought, Enki's role was often to maintain balance between chaos and order, justice and mercy, divine power and human need. When he acts, he does so to preserve equilibrium. Could this theme of balance help us interpret the Genesis story differently? Perhaps the fall from Eden could be seen not merely as punishment, but as a rebalancing, a shift that introduces moral complexity into a once simple existence. If Enki represents measured wisdom, and the serpent symbolizes the unpredictable force of curiosity, do both together illustrate the tension between divine order and human freedom, the tension that defines much of human history and spirituality. Questions to explore. Is the serpent in Eden a purely negative figure, or could it symbolize the human confrontation with moral awareness? Does Enki's mediating role suggest that knowledge is meant to be guided, not forbidden? How do both figures, serpent and Enki, reflect the broader human experience of seeking understanding within limits? Could the dual symbolism of both as helpers and troublemakers indicate that ancient cultures viewed wisdom as inherently dangerous yet essential? Are these myths ultimately warning against pride, or inviting humanity to reflect on the cost of enlightenment? The serpent and Enki stand as enduring symbols, complex, ambiguous, and deeply human. They embody the mystery of knowledge, its beauty, its danger, and its potential to transform both individuals and civilizations. Could it be that ancient storytellers used these figures to remind humanity of a timeless truth, that wisdom is never neutral, and that every revelation comes with responsibility? In Part 8, we will explore how these themes of knowledge and mediation evolve into ideas of rebellion, divine judgment, and redemption, and how the Serpent-Enki parallel continues to echo in later Mesopotamian and biblical traditions. Rebellion, Judgment, and Redemption, Lessons from the Serpent and Enki. In Part 7, we explored the Serpent and Enki as symbols, mediators between the divine and human worlds, embodying the tension between wisdom and obedience. In Part 8, we turn to a deeper question that underlies both the Sumerian and Genesis traditions: when knowledge challenges divine authority, does it become rebellion, or the beginning of redemption? What happens when human understanding grows beyond its limits, and how do these myths interpret the resulting judgment and transformation? Is seeking knowledge an act of rebellion or faith? In the Genesis account, eating the fruit is described as disobedience, a direct violation of God's command. Yet some might ask, is the desire for wisdom inherently wrong? Could curiosity itself be a reflection of being made in the image of a creator who knows all things? Similarly, in Sumerian texts, when Enki grants humanity knowledge, he sometimes acts against the decrees of higher gods, yet his actions are not always portrayed as evil. Could his defiance represent compassion rather than rebellion? Might these stories be inviting us to consider a complex moral question: when is defiance justified? When does questioning authority become a necessary act of growth rather than a fall from grace? The divine response to rebellion. Both the Bible and Sumerian myths describe divine judgment following human advancement or transgression. In Genesis, God expels Adam and Eve from Eden. In Sumerian stories like Atrahasis, the gods send plagues or floods when humanity's behavior or knowledge threatens cosmic order. But in both cases, there is also mercy. God clothes Adam and Eve before sending them out of the garden. Enki warns Atrahasis of the coming flood, preserving life. Could these gestures suggest that divine judgment is not purely punitive, but corrective, a means of restoring balance rather than destroying creation? If so, might both narratives be reflections on the balance between justice and compassion in divine character? And could the Serpent and Enki represent different sides of that same balance, one testing humanity's limits, the other teaching humanity to live within them? Human consequences and moral growth. After the fall, humanity must labor, suffer, and die. After Enki's interventions, humans must endure floods, famine, and hardship. Yet through these trials, humans learn survival, cooperation, and reverence. Could it be that these hardships are not curses, but necessary stages of moral development? Might the loss of innocence in Eden and the struggles of early civilization in Sumer both symbolize humanity's journey toward maturity, from dependence to accountability? Is wisdom, then, something that must be learned through struggle rather than granted freely? The role of the mediator in redemption. In Sumerian texts, Enki often restores balance after crisis, saving humanity through knowledge or foresight. In Genesis, though the serpent vanishes from the narrative, the theme of mediation reappears later through figures like Noah, Abraham, and ultimately Christ, who are portrayed as intercessors between God and humanity. Could this continuity suggest that the human story is one of ongoing reconciliation, where divine wisdom and human will continually meet, clash, and find harmony again? Is it possible that Enki's acts of preservation and the biblical theme of redemption both express a belief that divine mercy persists even in judgment? Rebellion as the path to understanding. There's a deeper irony in both traditions. What begins as rebellion often becomes revelation. In Eden, the act of disobedience leads to moral awareness. In Sumerian myths, forbidden knowledge often brings progress: agriculture, writing, cities, and law. Does this mean that rebellion is necessary for evolution, that humanity must challenge limits to grow? Or do these stories serve as cautions, reminding us that the cost of enlightenment is responsibility? Could ancient storytellers have been wrestling with the same paradox that modern societies face, that progress always tests moral boundaries? The possibility of redemption. If rebellion brings judgment, then what brings redemption? In both stories, redemption is not found in reversing knowledge but in learning to live with it wisely. Adam and Eve cannot return to Eden, but they can build a world beyond it, a world where wisdom and toil coexist. Likewise, in the Sumerian flood story, humanity must rebuild civilization with humility, aware of divine oversight but equipped with the tools to survive. Could redemption, then, mean accepting responsibility for knowledge, using it to heal rather than harm, to balance rather than dominate? And if so, might both myths be less about a fall and more about a transformation, the awakening of a moral conscience that leads to true wisdom? Questions to reflect on. Does divine punishment in these stories serve destruction or restoration? Are Enki and the serpent truly rebels, or are they instruments of divine teaching? Is knowledge meant to be restrained or redeemed through ethical use? Could rebellion be an essential part of humanity's spiritual evolution, a way to discover freedom, responsibility, and moral depth? How do these stories shape our understanding of justice, compassion, and the balance between divine authority and human agency? Both the Sumerian and Genesis narratives show that wisdom and rebellion are intertwined. The quest for understanding brings conflict, yet it also opens the path toward redemption. Through the serpent and Enki, we see a pattern: divine boundaries are tested, judgment follows, and yet mercy remains. Could it be that the ancient writers were teaching that knowledge is never the true sin, but pride, misuse, and forgetfulness of responsibility are? In this light, rebellion becomes not an end but a beginning, the spark that ignites humanity's long journey toward moral and spiritual maturity. In Part 9, we will turn to how these ideas evolve further in later traditions, exploring how the figure of the serpent changes meaning over time, and how Enki's legacy shapes ancient and biblical views of wisdom, justice, and divine mediation. The transformation of symbols, from Enki to the serpent of wisdom. In Part 8, we examined rebellion, judgment, and redemption, how divine punishment and mercy shape humanity's moral growth. Now, in Part 9, we turn to the long journey of symbols, how the serpent and Enki evolved over time, how their meanings transformed, and how both continued to influence later ideas of wisdom, temptation, and divine mediation. Could it be that the serpent and Enki were never fixed figures at all, but dynamic symbols that adapted to new cultures, reflecting changing ideas about knowledge, sin, and salvation? How do symbols evolve over time? Symbols, like stories, are living things. As civilizations rise and fall, symbols shift in meaning. What once represented wisdom might later represent danger, what once symbolized life might become a sign of death. So how did the serpent, once a neutral or even sacred image, become a universal emblem of deception and evil? And how did Enki, once the wise and compassionate god of water, fade into the background of history, even as his traits reappeared in other figures across cultures? Could this transformation reflect humanity's evolving relationship with knowledge itself, from curiosity and reverence to fear and control? The serpent in Mesopotamian and Near Eastern thought. Before the Serpent of Eden, serpentine symbols already held deep meaning in Mesopotamia. The serpent was associated with Ninjishida, a deity linked to life, fertility, and the underworld, often shown as a staff entwined by two serpents, an image echoed later in the Greek Caduceus. Might Ninjishida's symbolism have influenced how later cultures perceived serpents as guardians of life and gateways to the divine? If so, could the serpent in Eden have inherited this older symbolic complexity, long before being recast as an agent of temptation? And if Enki was sometimes associated with serpentine imagery, the flowing waters, the twisting forms of creation, might the two symbols have been intertwined even in early Sumerian thought? From wisdom to temptation, a shift in meaning. In the Sumerian worldview, divine knowledge was powerful but not inherently corrupting. Enki's wisdom served life. Yet by the time of the Hebrew Bible, knowledge had become morally charged, something that could lead to disobedience and separation from God. What caused this shift? Did the rise of ethical monotheism redefine divine wisdom as something that must come from God alone, making any other source suspicious? Could the serpent, once a symbol of life, have become a warning against rival sources of enlightenment? And what does this shift tell us about how human societies reinterpret ancient symbols to fit new moral frameworks? Enki's legacy in later wisdom traditions. Though the name Enki faded, his influence seems to echo in later traditions. In Akkadian culture, he became Ea, the god of deep waters and hidden wisdom. In Babylonian myth, Ea was credited with giving humanity rituals, law, and magic, gifts of order and knowledge. Could Ea's character have influenced later depictions of divine wisdom in other cultures, such as Thoth in Egypt or Hermes in Greece? These gods, too, were mediators, scribes, and patrons of knowledge. Might it be that the archetype of the wise mediator, a divine being who bridges heaven and earth, originated, in part, from the figure of Enki? The serpent and the search for healing. Interestingly, the serpent's image also persisted as a symbol of healing. The staff of Asclepius in Greek tradition, entwined by a single serpent, represented medicine and renewal. Even in the Bible, Moses raises a bronze serpent in the wilderness, through which the Israelites are healed, Numbers 21:8-9. How can one symbol represent both deception and healing, both sin and salvation? Could this duality reflect the complexity of wisdom itself, that the same power which can destroy can also restore, depending on how it is used? And might this dual role of the serpent, as both healer and deceiver, echo Enki's role as the god of both life-giving waters and moral testing? The parallel paths of Enki and the serpent. Let's consider the patterns once more. Both act as mediators, offering access to divine knowledge. Both trigger transformation, in human consciousness or destiny. Both are morally ambiguous, not purely good or evil, but complex. Both are tied to water or life. The serpent sheds its skin, Enki commands the fresh waters. Could these parallels suggest that the serpent of wisdom and Enki of creation were never entirely separate in the ancient imagination? Might they represent two expressions of the same archetype, the one who brings awareness and compels moral growth? If that's true, what might it mean that later tradition separated them, turning Enki's wisdom into something divine, and the serpent's wisdom into something dangerous? From myth to theology, the loss of nuance. As civilizations evolved, myth gave way to theology, and theology sought certainty. Ambiguous figures like Enki and the serpent, who blurred boundaries between good and evil, no longer fit neatly into emerging religious systems that valued moral clarity. Could this explain why the serpent became associated with Satan, the adversary, and why Enki's compassionate rebellion was forgotten? Perhaps the ancient storytellers who once celebrated the tension between wisdom and obedience were replaced by theologians who sought to resolve it. And yet, might we still need those older stories, not as doctrines, but as mirrors for our own struggle with knowledge and responsibility? Questions to reflect on. How do cultural shifts reshape the meanings of ancient symbols? Why did the serpent move from a symbol of life to one of deception? Could Enki's image have evolved into later wisdom deities across civilizations? Is the dual nature of the serpent, as healer and deceiver, a reflection of humanity's complex relationship with knowledge? What do these transformations tell us about our ongoing tension between curiosity, morality, and divine order? The serpent and Enki began as figures of mediation, bridges between divine power and human potential. Yet as human thought evolved, their images divided, Enki became the wise creator, the serpent became the deceiver. Could it be that in separating them, humanity lost something vital, the recognition that wisdom and temptation are two sides of the same experience, that understanding always carries risk? Perhaps the ancient myths were never meant to warn us against knowledge itself, but to remind us that knowledge demands humility, that true wisdom lies not in knowing everything, but in knowing how to use what we learn. In Part 10, we will explore how these ancient ideas continue to echo in later religious, philosophical, and mystical traditions, from early Judaism and Christianity to Gnostic and esoteric thought, and how the serpent and Enki's shared legacy shaped humanity's enduring quest for divine understanding. Echoes through time, from Enki's waters to the serpent's wisdom. As humanity moved beyond the ancient Mesopotamian plains, the stories of gods and men traveled too, reshaped by new languages, beliefs, and empires. Yet echoes of older truths lingered, faint but familiar, within later traditions. Could it be that the essence of Enki's wisdom, and the serpent's challenge in Eden, survived quietly through the centuries, reappearing in philosophies, religions, and mysteries that sought to reconcile divine truth and human curiosity? If so, where do we hear those echoes most clearly? And what do they tell us about how the ancients viewed knowledge, creation, and the divine? The continuing thread of wisdom, a universal symbol. Wisdom, in nearly every tradition, is personified as something both divine and dangerous. In Proverbs, she stands at the crossroads calling to all who will listen. In Greek thought, wisdom, Sophia, becomes the guiding principle of reason and virtue. In Egypt, Thoth guards secret knowledge and the balance of cosmic order. Could these diverse depictions share a single root, perhaps the ancient Mesopotamian image of Enki, the god who knew the deep, who gave humans language, law, and insight? If wisdom was once embodied in a god of water, is it possible that the symbolism of water, flowing, nourishing, yet capable of destruction, reflected humanity's ambivalence toward knowledge itself? And could the serpent, who moved fluidly upon the ground as water flows upon the earth, have represented that same dual power, wisdom that gives life, and wisdom that can wound? The Gnostic reversal, redefining the serpent. Centuries later, in the early Christian era, certain Gnostic sects began to reinterpret Genesis in radical ways. To them, the serpent was not a deceiver but a liberator, a being who opened humanity's eyes to divine awareness. They asked, if knowledge of good and evil brought understanding, was the serpent's act truly evil? Or was it the first awakening of human consciousness? Could these Gnostics have sensed something of the older Mesopotamian worldview, one where divine knowledge was a gift, not a curse? Were they, perhaps unknowingly, reviving echoes of Enki's ancient compassion, the god who defied divine decree to help humanity survive the flood? If so, what might that say about how collective memory preserves old ideas beneath the surface of new religions? The serpent in the wilderness, a symbol redeemed. In the book of Numbers, Moses lifts a bronze serpent upon a pole, and those who look upon it are healed. Centuries later, Jesus would reference this event in John 3 verses 14 to 15, comparing it to his own crucifixion. How strange, the same creature once condemned in Eden becomes, for a moment, a symbol of salvation. Why does the Bible allow this paradox to exist? Could this be a hidden acknowledgement of the serpent's dual role, both the bringer of death and the agent of healing? Does it suggest that divine wisdom, like fire, can purify or destroy depending on how it's used? And if Enki's waters once washed the world clean in mythic floods, is it possible that water and serpent alike were never meant to symbolize punishment alone, but also renewal? Enki's waters and baptismal symbolism. The connection between water and rebirth runs deep through many faiths. In Christianity, baptism represents death to sin and rebirth into life. In ancient Sumer, the Abzu, Enki's domain, was the primordial sea from which all life emerged. Could the waters of baptism echo the same spiritual truth the Sumerians once told in mythic form, that all creation and all renewal flow from divine wisdom? When Jesus speaks of living water in the Gospel of John, might that imagery be part of a timeless human pattern, seeing wisdom as something fluid, cleansing, and life-giving? And if Enki was once the keeper of those waters, could his story be one early expression of that enduring idea, that divine knowledge restores rather than destroys? The fall and the flood, two sides of the same story? Both the fall and the flood are about boundaries, limits set by divine authority, and the consequences of crossing them. In Eden, knowledge brings exile; in the flood, disobedience brings destruction. Yet both stories also contain mercy, a covering, an ark, a promise of restoration. Could Enki's defiance to save humanity and the serpent's offer of knowledge be two expressions of the same theme, divine compassion disguised as rebellion? If so, might the moral tension between obedience and enlightenment be less about choosing one over the other, and more about learning balance, the ability to seek truth without losing reverence? And could that balance be what the ancients meant by true wisdom, a harmony of knowing and obeying, of freedom and faith? Echoes in Christian mysticism and Jewish wisdom tradition. In later Jewish and Christian mysticism, the idea of divine wisdom, Chokhmah or Sophia, becomes central. In Proverbs 8, wisdom speaks as one present at creation, rejoicing before God and delighting in humanity. Could this wisdom be a refined echo of earlier deities like Enki, cosmic intelligence personified? If so, what might it mean that the Bible retains her voice yet strips her of divine independence, aligning her fully with God's will? And does that realignment suggest humanity's desire to reclaim the serpent's gift, knowledge, but to purify it, sanctify it, and make it safe within divine order? The river of knowledge, a universal pattern. From the four rivers of Eden to the Tigris and Euphrates of Sumer, from the Nile of Egypt to the sacred Ganges of India, rivers flow through humanity's spiritual geography. Is it coincidence that Enki's domain, the Abzu, was also a subterranean sea feeding the world's waters, just as wisdom, hidden and deep, nourishes the surface of human understanding? If all ancient peoples saw water as both a creative and cleansing force, might that explain why so many of their gods of wisdom, Enki, Thoth, Hermes, and even Jesus, are linked to flowing water or speech. Could living water be the universal metaphor for divine consciousness, the ever-moving, ever-renewing current of truth? Knowledge and responsibility, the lesson that endures. Every retelling of the serpent story raises one unavoidable question: what do we do with what we know? Whether in Eden, Eridu, or any mythic landscape, knowledge changes everything. It opens eyes, breaks innocence, demands accountability. Perhaps this is why both Enki and the serpent appear as moral tests, not because they were evil, but because they represent the cost of awareness. Once we see, we cannot unsee. Once we understand, we must choose how to live by that understanding. Could that be the timeless lesson beneath both myths, that wisdom is divine only when tempered by humility, that knowledge becomes dangerous when severed from reverence? Questions to ponder. Do water and serpent symbols represent the same sacred truth, that wisdom is both life-giving and perilous? How did ancient ideas of Enki's compassion shape later views of divine mercy and enlightenment? Could Gnostic and mystical traditions be faint memories of Sumerian themes transformed over millennia? Does the persistence of these symbols suggest that humanity is still wrestling with the same question, how to seek knowledge without losing innocence? And if so, what does that say about the continuity of the human soul's search for truth? Across ages and cultures, the story repeats: a divine being offers wisdom, humanity receives, resists, and redefines it. Enki's waters and the serpent's whisper both invite the same choice: to awaken. But awakening is costly. It demands discernment, compassion, and humility, the very virtues that make knowledge sacred instead of destructive. Perhaps this is the quiet truth running beneath every myth and scripture, that wisdom, like a river, flows from one source, and though its channels differ, its purpose remains the same: to nourish life and reveal the divine within creation. In Part 11, the final chapter, we will bring the threads together, exploring what the enduring connection between Enki and the serpent means for modern understanding of faith, history, and the eternal human desire to know the divine. The living legacy, rediscovering the divine wisdom of the ancients. Throughout this journey, we have followed a winding river of myth, from the shimmering temples of Sumer to the quiet Garden of Eden, from Enki's Abzu to the serpent's tree, from ancient clay tablets to sacred scriptures. And at every turn, one question has lingered. Could the story of the serpent and the story of Enki be two reflections of the same ancient truth, the human struggle to understand divine knowledge and its purpose? Let us now step back, look at the whole picture, and ask what this connection might mean, not only for history, but for faith, for wisdom, and for the way we see ourselves. The thread that binds myth and scripture. From the earliest myths, humanity sensed a tension between the divine and the mortal, between the gods who possessed knowledge and the humans who longed for it. In Sumer, Enki gave wisdom freely, shaping humans to understand and survive. In Eden, the serpent offered knowledge, and humanity's eyes were opened. In both, enlightenment brought both blessing and burden. Could it be that these tales, though separated by language and centuries, reflect a single human truth, that awareness itself is a gift that comes with responsibility? And if so, were the ancient Sumerians and the Hebrew scribes both wrestling with the same moral question: what happens when humans touch the realm of the divine? The duality of divine wisdom. Enki's water nourishes and floods, the serpent's knowledge enlightens and condemns. Both reveal a profound paradox, that wisdom can heal or harm depending on how it is received. Could it be that ancient people recognized this before philosophy had words for it, that good and evil were not forces in eternal opposition, but choices emerging from the same divine potential? If Enki's defiance and the serpent's temptation are two sides of the same archetype, might the fall of humanity also be its beginning, a step toward moral maturity rather than a descent into corruption? Perhaps the ancients were not describing rebellion at all, but transformation, the necessary awakening of a being destined to choose, to love, and to learn. The human condition, between obedience and understanding. Every myth that endures speaks to the heart of what it means to be human. And both the story of Enki and the story of Eden pose the same timeless dilemma. Should humanity obey without question, or seek to understand even when it leads to pain? Was Enki wrong to defy Enlil and save humankind from the flood? Was the serpent wrong to invite Eve to see the world as God sees it? Or are these questions themselves the point, reminders that wisdom is not found in blind obedience or reckless curiosity, but somewhere between the two? Could it be that these stories teach us to walk that narrow path, to seek knowledge humbly, remembering that all understanding, if misused, can destroy? Echoes in our age, the modern search for the divine. Thousands of years later, humanity is still asking the same questions. Science gives us knowledge that once belonged only to the gods. Technology reshapes creation itself. Are we, in some sense, living a new version of the ancient myth, reaching for the fruit of divine understanding once again? And if so, might the ancient stories be whispering to us even now, reminding us that knowledge without wisdom is perilous, that creation without compassion is hollow, that enlightenment without reverence becomes pride? The serpent and Enki both offered something divine. But what humanity does with that gift determines whether it becomes blessing or curse. The forgotten balance, reconciling faith and knowledge. Perhaps the ancient Sumerians and the writers of Genesis were not enemies in belief, but travelers on the same path. Each sought to answer life's greatest mystery: how can finite beings relate to infinite wisdom? The Sumerians expressed it through gods and waters, the Hebrews, through the Creator and His Word. But underneath, both seem to sense that divine truth is not something owned, but something encountered. Could the forbidden knowledge of Eden be the same wisdom Enki guarded, not forbidden because it was evil, but because it was sacred, meant to be received in reverence rather than seized in pride? And could the entire human story, from the first civilization to our own, be the unfolding of that same lesson, that knowledge must serve love, or it will consume itself? The redemption of the serpent, the return to wisdom. If the serpent became the symbol of deception, perhaps redemption lies in remembering what it once symbolized: life, healing, renewal. When Moses lifted the bronze serpent in the desert, those who looked upon it were healed. When Christ compared himself to that serpent, he reclaimed the symbol of death and turned it into salvation. Could this be the final echo of Enki's waters, the transformation of divine knowledge into divine grace? Perhaps the serpent story was never about rebellion, but restoration, a mirror of God's own mystery, that life often comes through the very thing that first brought suffering. The living wisdom, a river that never stops flowing. In every age, truth moves like water, changing shape, flowing through different languages, yet always returning to the same source. From Enki's Abzu to the rivers of Eden, from the wells of wisdom to the living waters of Christ, the message endures: wisdom flows from the divine, not to divide, but to renew. Could it be that the serpent's whisper, stripped of its deceit, was always meant to lead humanity back to the source, not away from God, but toward a deeper awareness of Him? If so, then the forbidden fruit was never meant to destroy, but to awaken, to draw us into a journey that continues still, the quest to know God as both mystery and truth. Questions for the seeker. What if the serpent in Eden was never merely a tempter, but a teacher, misunderstood through the lens of later fear? Could Enki's compassion in the Sumerian texts reveal something about God's mercy toward humankind? How might understanding these myths side by side deepen, rather than weaken, faith? Are we, even now, repeating the same story, seeking divine knowledge without divine wisdom? And if the ancient stories were metaphors for our inner journey, what might the tree of knowledge really be, an outer test, or an inward awakening? The circle completes, from ancient water to living word. And so, as we conclude, we return to where we began: a God of wisdom, a serpent of knowledge, a humanity caught between awe and curiosity. Perhaps they were never separate stories at all, but one great human parable told in many tongues, a reminder that divine wisdom has always flowed through our history, waiting for each generation to rediscover it. Could it be that in understanding both Enki and the serpent, we are not merely studying the past, but awakening to something ancient within ourselves, the spark that longs to know, to create, and to walk again with the divine in the cool of the day? Maybe the true forbidden connection between Eden and the Anunnaki is not about gods or angels or aliens, but about humanity's unending dialogue with the divine, our thirst to understand the source from which all wisdom flows. And perhaps, after all these ages, the lesson remains the same. The knowledge of the divine is not forbidden, only forgotten. It waits, as it always has, beneath the surface of faith and reason alike, like a river beneath the earth, ready to rise again when we are humble enough to seek it. So we close this journey not with an answer, but with an invitation, to see the serpent not as the end of innocence, but as the beginning of understanding, to see Enki not as a rival to heaven, but as a symbol of the divine impulse within creation itself. And as we listen to the echoes of Sumer and scripture, may we remember that the quest for wisdom is as old as humanity and as sacred as the breath of life itself.